team here in Betak, my co-manager Nidhi, as well as our wonderful volunteers. Round here, you can't see him. We have Mudit, we have Naveen, Shaylee, Phoebe, Digvijay, as well as our author liaisons who help us take the authors to and from. We've got Isabel and Divyani. We're very, very grateful. Without all of this help, none of this could have happened. So I hope that you've had a really great experience with all of our volunteers because they are wonderful and we are very, very grateful to them. Exactly. The other thing, of course, is to mention that we would love you to have your phones on silent. Silent mode, usually on the side of iPhones, it's at the side. Click it close for us, please. Please don't look at me like, I don't know how to do it. That happens. You know how to do it. Turn it on to silent. Show some respect for our speakers. Show some respect for your fellow audience members. Please don't disrupt the session. Mr. Raghavan will be signing his books at the end of the session, so I'll just let you know about that now. The book signing tent is out of Betak and on the right-hand side. It's a green-colored tent. It says book signing. Ours is on the right-hand side. So if we don't get round to you in the question section, in the Q&A part, if we don't get round to you, I'm sure he'll be very happy to answer any of your questions then. Okay, if it's all right with everybody, we're going to kick off this session. This is Poetry and Politics in Mogul India. So would you please give a very warm welcome to our speakers, T.C.A Raghavan and Audrey Truschke.
Thank you and good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I am Audrey Truschke. It is my pleasure to be here talking with and introducing T.C.A Raghavan. T.C.A Raghavan, for those of you who are not familiar with his story and career, he has been a longstanding prominent Indian diplomat. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1982 and worked there for a number of decades. Among other posts, he was the Indian High Commissioner and Ambassador to Singapore and Pakistan, among other prominent positions. So Mr. Raghavan has relatively recently retired, and upon retiring, one of the first things that he did was come out with this lovely book. The title is Attendant Lords, Bairam Khan and Abdur Rahim, Courtiers and Poets in Mughal India. I think that this is quite magnificent, quite extraordinary, right? Someone who has had a distinguished career as an Indian diplomat, obviously working in and thinking about modern times. He gets some time to himself, and what does he do? He looks back to the 16th and 17th centuries, back to India's Mughal past, and decides to tell the story not of kings, not of princes, as we so often talk about with the Mughals, but of courtiers, who are also men of letters, men of poetry. So it is my pleasure now to turn over the microphone to Mr. Raghavan. He's going to talk for a little bit about his book, tell us some things about it, and then we'll sort of have a conversation, and towards the end we will, of course, open it up to audience questions. Mr. Raghavan.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for that very complimentary introduction, and I'm very grateful to the JK Jaipur Literary Festival for inviting me here. But let me talk a little bit about the book. All of us know about Rahim. Most of us have studied him in school in class 6, 7, 8, which is when I first encountered him. And he remained in my mind more as a curious figure, because in the descriptions of him, we would learn about him as having been a darbari or a courtier, and that he was an important figure in Akbar's and Jahangir's court. But Rahim came together for me really in Delhi once when I happened to visit what I then thought was his tomb, the place where he was buried in, and this is in Nizamuddin, very close to Humayun's tomb, and it's called the Khan Khana's Maqbara. But when I made some inquiries, I realized that this is not the place Abdur Rahim had built for his tomb. He just happened to be buried over there, but he actually built it in memory of his wife. And it remains one of the very few structures of that size built in the memory of a woman who was not a royal in the Mughal court. So it gave you an extraordinary insight into the man, and like many of us, I felt that while our history is very rich, but somehow it lacks blood and flesh. And I started reading about Rahim and then learnt more and more about him, and it's an extraordinary story. But then I realized, perhaps midway too, that I can, as it often happens, you can only tell the story of the man by also looking at his father. And then his father, Bairam Khan, another great general of the Mughal Empire, who was regent in Akbar's court, came into the story. And then Abdur Rahim and Bairam Khan together, really they have very similar life trajectories. And it's an arresting and most compelling drama in the 16th and 17th centuries. Between the two of them, they see Bairam joined the Mughal court in Kabul. He was originally from Central Asia. And as I explain in my book, in Turkmenistan, after Turkmenistan broke away from the Soviet Union, Bairam Khan became a national hero. So he was originally from Central Asia. His father and grandfather, in search of employment, came to Kabul. Bairam Khan joined Babur's court, served under Humayun, came with the Mughal army, fought in the Battle of Panipat in 1526, and that's how the Mughal Empire began. But Bairam then is a slightly incidental figure because he's not very important. And after Humayun becomes emperor, he faces great adversity from a resurgent Afghan restoration under Shah Suri. And he's decisively defeated in a number of battles and forced out of India, which is when Bairam Khan, by then a grown, mature man, advised Humayun that let's go to Persia. I know people over there, and we can raise an army, come back, and regain your empire. So Bairam took Humayun to Persia, where they reached an alliance with the Persian Shah. Very difficult negotiation, because the Persians insisted, as a condition for any help, that Humayun should become Shia, which of course was difficult for Humayun, but Bairam was a Shia himself, and he was able to convince him that, look, it doesn't matter. What is important is that we regain your empire. And then at the head of a Persian army from Bairam and Humayun, go back to Afghanistan, defeat one of Humayun's brother who is ruling Kabul, come back and stake a claim to the throne of Delhi again. This is a period of about 30 years, and really it ends with the second battle of Panipat. Almost 30 years after the first battle, by then Humayun is dead, Akbar is a very young boy, and Bairam is the regent of the empire. And for 4 years he remained as regent, but by the time Akbar was 17, he was getting tired of having a regent around him. So Bairam unfortunately had to leave. Akbar, in a sense, deposed him, and while going on the Hajj, he's killed, not at Akbar's orders, as a result of another feud. And then we find a young Abdur Rahim, just 5 years old, coming to the Mughal court, where I think Akbar, out of a sense of guilt at the way Bairam had been treated and the way he had been killed, brought up Rahim as a very, very close member of his family. And by the time Rahim is 15 or 16 years old, which is in the mid-1570s, and from then till about 1600, 25 years, you find Abdur Rahim cannot do anything wrong. He conquers Sindh for the Mughals. He wins 2 major battles in Gujarat, and he writes a great deal of poetry, some of which we have read in school. Now, Bairam was a poet himself, and Bairam was a man who measured a person by, of course, his military skills and his generalship, but also by his poetical ability, and that is something Abdur Rahim inherited. What we read about Rahim, what we read of Rahim in schools is something he wrote towards the end of his life, which are his dohas, which is this philosopher, statesman looking back on his life and preaching the virtues of everyday existence, how to be a good son, how to be a good friend, how to lead a virtuous life. But in the 1580s and 1590s, he's writing a host of other kind of poetry, which we often don't know about. He wrote, for instance, a great deal of love poetry, or what is called Shringar Ras. in Shringar Ras. He wrote a whole Nayaka Bhed, which is a classic of 16th century, 17th century, 16th and 17th century literature. He wrote something else called the Shringar Sarota. Again, very, very sensuous, almost erotic verse. And so he wrote a number of compositions of this kind. There's a beautiful composition of his in which he describes 100 different women in different occupational tasks. So the elephant rider's wife, the shield maker's wife, the soldier's wife, the paper maker's wife. It's a riveting description because evidently while he saw political stature and political position and winning the great battles is important, he also possibly realized that in Akbar's court, to really reach the top, you also have to be a good poet. Now, the second half of Rahim's life is unfortunately somewhat tragic, because then the succession dispute between Akbar and Jahangir takes over. He's on the wrong side of it, but manages to survive. And then he spends a very long time in the Deccan. His capital was Burhanpur, and he was leading campaigns against Ahmednagar, Bijapur, and the other Deccan kingdoms. And certainly towards the end of his life, it's a very tragic life story, because by the end of the second decade, Jahangir faces a rebellion from his oldest son, Shah Jahan, and Abdur Rahim is then, like many other nobles, left in the middle, not knowing which side to choose. And they know that this can only end with disaster for all of them, whoever wins, and that is precisely what happens to him, because his sons and grandsons are killed, he is disgraced, and so on and so forth. But this is really what interested me about both these Mughal nobles, and I thought I should try to make them into as much of flesh and blood characters as is possible, making sure, of course, that this was a work of history and not a work of friction. So I talk a lot about their friendships, their wives, the people they knew, how friends and colleagues drift apart, because the Mughal court was a court of great intrigue. And there were a number of factions, and you had to keep choosing which side you have to be on, and it was very, very difficult to know what was happening. I mean, this was the time, the transition from Akbar to Jahangir was also in many ways a change in many of the values which Akbar had tried to instill in his court. So one of the things which I try to address is as to how does Rahim deal with these different ideological currents, the divisions between Hindus and Muslims. Because if you just read the Hindi literature, you have one particular view of Rahim, because he writes a great deal of Vaishnavite verse, a great deal of devotional verse in praise of Ram, Krishna, and so on. But if you read what the Persian poets say about him, or his other acquaintances and his other relationships with some people whom we would today call bigots, it brings out another side of Abdur Rahim. And certainly, unless you put both these sides together, it's difficult to get a full measure of the man. So I've tried to bring this story up to date in the sense I found that while, of course, Abdur Rahim was dead by 1627, but memories of him remain. And then later in the 19th century, these memories are revived as the debate between Hindi and Urdu progressed in North India. And the Hindi scholars found in Rahim a great protagonist to show the ancestry of the Hindi language. While many of the Muslim intellectuals of the time used to feel that a good, outstanding Muslim like Rahim could not have possibly written all this devotional verse. And that really brings the story up to our own time as to how we engage with our history. And it can often be a unifying factor, but often a very divisive force. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's so much there in Mr. Raghavan's comments and in your book, of course. Let me begin with asking you about the sort of the focus on non-royal subjects, non-kingly subjects, right? I mean, this is sort of put front and center with the title of the book, right? Attendant Lords, borrowing from a T.S. Eliot poem, if I'm correct, right? Where Alfred Prufrock says, oh, I'm not Hamlet, right? I'm just a little guy. And yet he goes on to have all these great ideas and questions in that poem. And in the same way, I mean, in Mughal history and historiography, there's such an emphasis on the kings, right? My first book is on Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan. My next book is on Aurangzeb, and I have been rightly criticized for this sort of undue emphasis on royalty. So why did you decide to focus on the next level down, the courtier level? And what do you think that emphasis, these non-royal figures, allows you to do?
Well, I always felt that we see Mughals as either good or bad. So the good ones are the ones in the beginning, and the bad ones are the ones which follow for a variety of reasons. And by looking at the next level, I thought you see persons much more clearly beyond this polarity of good and bad, because Rahim really is neither good or bad. He's like all of us, deeply flawed in some ways, as is his father. Very ambitious, into all the intrigues possible. One by one, he goes against his friends, but he retains a certain core integrity despite all that, and he's also a wonderful poet. So when you see characters with all their flaws, and these come out in many writings about him by his contemporaries and so on, and not simply as good or bad, it enables you to identify much more with their times, because these were highly uncertain, very difficult circumstances they had to deal with. And I've always felt that there is enough information and evidence available about the Mughals to look at different strata and not just at the royals.
Excellent. So one other thing that I would ask about, so as you say, I mean, there's so much intrigue in the Mughal court. There's so much politicking, right? Who do we side with? What do we do? What's going on in the back room? And one thing that I found very intriguing about your book is you sort of go back and forth, right? On the one hand, at certain points you're talking about these sort of intense political intrigues. One almost gets lost in them. And then you switch over to the poetry. Right? And so I was wondering if you could maybe say a little bit about how you see this poetry-politics relationship.
I thought, in my impression, most of the great nobles saw poetry not as something different from their politics, but as a vital part of their lives to cement their political careers. And therefore, to be a great general, to be a great courtier, to be someone important in the court, you also had to be a good poet. And this was not something abstract. It was something very much, very pragmatic, in a way almost mercenary. We see in the case of Bairam Khan, for instance, also a very good poet. He uses poetry as a way of flattering the emperor or those very close to him. I mean, poetry as an instrument of flattery is something intrinsic to a lot of Bairam Khan's writings. In the case of Rahim, I think poetry was important for him because he grew up at a time when the Rajput alliance, which Akbar had forged, was maturing. And certainly we know that he grew up in a court in which Man Singh, the Prince of Amber, was there as a young boy. Possibly Rahim used to have the same tutors as Man Singh did, because we are told at some stages that Man Singh was told, he was a few years older than Abdur Rahim, that please keep an eye on this boy. So possibly he had the same Sanskrit tutor, the same Hindustani, Brij Bhasha and Avdi tutors, because he wrote, when he was still a teenager, a book on astrology, which is unusual until one realizes that while the Mughals were interested in horoscopes and astrology, what gave it a real push was the entry of the Rajput women in. Because with the Rajput women and their entourages also came the Hindu astrologers, and the Mughals were as keen to have their horoscopes cast as any of us are today. So I think Rahim used his poetry in Hindi, and especially the devotional verses in the 1580s, 1590s, to demonstrate to Akbar that I'm not like the conservative bigots amongst the ulama whom you are trying to fight. I'm very much thinking, I'm a thinker like you. I'm open to all influences. I'm open to all religions. And in that sense, therefore, it was a vital part of his politics within the court.
I think that that's very, I mean, that's all very enlightening, but I particularly like how you emphasize that there were sort of practical applications to poetry in Mughal India, right? So often today, I think we think about poetry, right or wrong, as a sort of expression of one's innermost feelings. It's a very emotional practice, and you know, not that that was absent in the past, but there was perhaps a bit more to it. Speaking more specifically about Rahim, right, Abdur Rahim Khan Khanan, let me ask you to sort of elaborate on how you see him positioning himself in terms of sort of Hindu ideas versus more conservative Islamic ideas, right? At a certain point in the book, I really like how you kind of grapple with sort of two different visions we get of Abdur Rahim. On the one hand, as you spoke a little bit about in his Hindi poetry, right? I mean, he's sort of very embracing, wide open arms, Hindu ideas, no problem. But then, for instance, you talk about a letter exchange between Rahim and Ahmad Sirhindi, one of the great polemicists of this period, where Rahim comes across as almost a staunch conservative, right? Not the sort of person we would think of as writing these Hindi dohas. So if you could just talk a little bit about that tension, what that tells us about the complexity of Abdur Rahim, and sort of how we've maybe made certain Mughal figures into being more tolerant than they actually were.
Well, in Rahim's case, it's very interesting because by the early 19th century, a great deal about him had been forgotten. You find scattered odd verses by him in one or the other collection, but Rahim as a person and as this important Hindi poet was really not on anyone's radar. He's brought back in from the late 19th century when the Devanagari movement in India was gaining momentum. And then Hindi scholars encountered this Mughal nobleman who was writing such wonderful, beautiful, devotional poetry, and they immediately claimed him as one of their own. That ye Hindutva ka pratik hai, because he's someone at the heart of Mughal power, but he gives so much importance to Hindu gods, to Hindu goddesses, to the language, to our language, that he knows Sanskrit, etc., etc. But to go back to Rahim's time, it's also unusual to see that while he has under his patronage a large number of Hindi poets, and some of the best known names of Hindi literature were either well known to him or were obliged to him for help. You have Keshav Das, you have Gang, some people say Tulsi Das, and so on. But if you read what many of the others in the court have to say about him, you get a contrasting picture. You have a secret history written in Akbar's time by this very, very conservative, almost bigoted scholar named Abdul Qadir Badayuni. And Badayuni's history was a secret one because he never dared to show it to anyone because he was so scared of being killed if the emperor found out, if Akbar found out what he was writing. Now, Abdul Qadir Badayuni, in fact, praises Rahim as being a very good Muslim, a very conservative Muslim who helps Muslims in distress who have come on the wrong side of Akbar because they disagreed with his eclectic and liberal experiments. And there are many other examples, and certainly the letter exchange, although we don't have the letters which Rahim wrote to Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, but we have all the letters which Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi wrote to Rahim. That brings out again a different part of his personality. And Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, I should remind you, is one of the great, and in Pakistan when you live there, you realize that he's regarded as the original protagonist of Muslim separatism in South Asia. He's called the regenerator of the second millennium and so on. Now, how do we reconcile these two different facets. And I would say it has a great deal to do with the transition from the Akbari dispensation to Jahangir and Shah Jahan. If you wanted to remain relevant and important in the Mughal court, you could not pretend that Akbar had died. Or you could not pretend that Akbar was not dead. You had to adjust to a new emperor and to a new framework in the court, which was more conservative, less Catholic, and certainly much less eclectic and liberal than Akbar was. And I think Rahim was trying to appeal to different constituencies throughout his career, which is where his father comes in, because his father was killed when he was a young boy. He had all those insecurities, and he realized, I think, instinctively and from the very beginning, that to progress in the court, you must have a line open to all the different factions which exist, that I'm not a royal prince, that I can get away with the kind of eclecticism which Akbar enjoyed so much. He had to be more careful. He had to have a line open to the conservatives, to the more orthodox elements, to the ulemas, but also to the Rajputs and the new elements entering the court then.
And so we've talked now a bit about Rahim. Let me ask about Bairam Khan, right? We talk about Rahim so much more than we talk about Bairam Khan in Mughal historiography. And yet you tell a very fascinating tale about him. And you do especially well with the sort of gaps we have in his life. And you sort of flag where those are. I thought that the most kind of dramatic moment in Bairam Khan's life was sort of this moment when Humayun is fleeing India, right? He's managed to lose Babur's crown and throne, and Bairam Khan sticks by him, right? I mean, everybody else is fleeing Humayun's side as if the man has the plague, and yet Bairam Khan sticks with him, and it's a good thing he did, right? For when we get to the Safavid court and what happens there. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Bairam Khan, and especially why did he stick with the Mughals?
I think one tends to forget when one reads Bairam Khan's about his life, how old he was by the time Akbar by the time Akbar was born, and when Humayun was fleeing India via Sindh towards Afghanistan, and he couldn't enter Afghanistan because his brothers stopped him. I think Bairam by then was too late to change sides. Many Mughals did. They either crossed over to one of Humayun's brothers or to the Afghans, but for Bairam it was too late for that. He was already in his 40s or so, and he had to stick it through with Humayun. And I think he realized that, you see, one tends to forget, in fact one forgets, that Humayun, when he lost to Sher Shah Suri and was fleeing, he was emperor with an entourage of 20 people, or maybe 30 people. He was finished, he was history. So Bairam, when he saw this small group and the emperor helpless, realized that this is where he can come into the center stage. And he can guide the emperor and take him to Persia, persuade the Shah to raise an army which would help them regain first Kabul and then come to Delhi and defeat the Afghans. I think he was confident about it because many of his former Turkmen clansmen were in important positions in the Persian Shah's court, and that he was a Shia. I think that is really what added to Bairam's middleman value between Humayun and the Persian Shah. And perhaps that is the reason why he decided to stick with him. Possibly it also showed great qualities of loyalty, that he was not going to discard an emperor just because he had lost his empire. And certainly he shows this quality of loyalty throughout his life. I mean, in Indian history, the character who comes closest to mind when you think of Bairam Khan is Durgadas Rathore. Very similar qualities of loyalty, because he felt that he had served this emperor and had to help him no matter how difficult the circumstances were.
So The book is very rich in history, but one thing that I think makes it exceptional is that it is equally rich in terms of what goes on in the 19th, 20th, and even the 21st centuries in terms of historical and popular memory of these figures. And you already spoke a little bit about sort of the Hindi-Urdu movements and ideas, right, and how that kind of plays into the recovered memory of Abdur Rahim in particular. But I wanted to ask you more about today. Right, and the politics of Mughal history today. And to frame this question, I actually want to read just a short section from the book. So this is on the last page 302, right? So I get to the end of this wonderful tome, and I read, Abdur Rahim thus becomes a political symbol of national integration and unity. Right? And I read that and I thought, oh, well, that's a good thing, right? We like national integration, we like unity, this is very positive. But then you go on. As in the case of Bairam Khan, but even more so in Abdur Rahim's, there is a risk that the political statement may supersede and even diminish the texture of the life story with its many facets, tensions, and contradictions, which allow us to navigate the distance separating us from them. So with that sort of in mind, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the politics of doing Mughal history today. And one thing that especially struck me about this passage is the idea that it's not always the bad politics, right? The Mughals are not always divisive figures. They can be sort of figures that bring us together, even if that is not the most accurate way to look at the past.
Well, certainly, I think anywhere in the world, while the historian or anyone who tries to write history writes about the past and trying to imagine the way it really was, but he does so from the present. And as far as Mughal history is concerned, I think 20th century communalism and Muslim separatism in India has really colored all our views of Mughal history in different ways. In 1946, a very, very popular Bollywood film was made about Bairam Khan, in which Bairam Khan is kind of a proto Akbar. Now the film, when you see it, doesn't begin like that. It begins as a straightforward historical, but midway through, Bairam's personality changes. And I would like to imagine that this is because the director and the producer realized that and possibly 1945 and 1946, it was becoming clearer and clearer to many people that the communal situation had become very bad. Pakistan was possibly a reality. And they were using the figure of Bairam Khan to say that, no, India must remain united. Now, certainly, therefore, what happens in the present does affect your view of the past. In Abdur Rahim's case, because he was an important noble, a great general, great military victories to his credit, but also this poet who composed devotional verses in Hindi, he became a figure of national integration. And in fact, that is the way we were taught about him in schools and the way he is still taught in schools today. But I felt that while that is important, and certainly history has a role in curriculum in any nation, but nevertheless, it is also important to look at the way things really were and to see them as persons very much like we are today, with character flaws, with personality flaws, with great ambition, great ability, and then see how these different parts of the character meld together. So if you only see them as icons and you don't see them as real historical figures, as I say, I thought that diminishes the quality of the person in some ways.
And so with that, with the focus on complex figures as opposed to icons, we would now like to open it up to the audience and take some questions. Yes, 7th or 8th row in the back there.
Thank you, sir. This was a wonderful talk. So my question is related to the Hindi poetry written by Rahim. So if I'm not too wrong, almost 3 centuries before Rahim, Amir Khusro was also writing Hindi poetry. So was there any influence of Khusro on Rahim's poetry? And in general, I'm also curious about how Amir Khusro's poetry was received at Akbar's court. Was it known and how was it appreciated? Thank you.
Well, I know in Dr. Truschke's book there's a great deal about that. And certainly, Amir Khusro had a profound influence on the Mughal court. In one of his earliest works, which was a Sanskrit-Persian mixed astrological poem, he begins by saying, many of my ancestors have composed poetry in this mixed language, and somewhat precociously says, and I will do the same. And he was obviously referring to Amir Khusro. Amir Khusro's, the fact that he's buried in Nizamuddin, which was very, very important to the Mughals too. But to answer your question in brief, Khusro had a profound influence on everyone writing in the Mughal court. Would you like to add to that, Dr. Truschke?
Yeah, and I completely concur. The Mughals were highly interested in Amir Khusro, right? I mean, there are even moments when they sort of adopt some Persian works of his and sort of fill in some of the gaps that have had arisen over the generations. I will say I remain a little bit less clear on Amir Khusro's Hindi poetry and what exactly that looked like. How far back some of that is sort of clearly datable in sort of a strict historical mindset does remain a little bit uncertain. Other questions? Right over here, yes.
We just talked about, you just talked about the power politics in Mughals court, and from different princes and rulers of different areas. So I just want to know if they had religion-based politics back then, like we have today, and also like there was a famous work of Akbar, I believe, Deen-e-Ilahi. Akbar was such a powerful leader. So why the Deen-e-Ilahi never took off? Thank you.
Well, you see, from what I know, and there are different readings of this, and I would encourage you to develop your own reading. Deen-e-Ilahi was not meant to be a new religion. In fact, the term Deen-e-Ilahi was never used. The term often used is Sulh-e-Kul. But this was a cult around the emperor, and only his very close associates really subscribed to it or became murids of it. Abdur Rahim did not. Very interesting. He was brought up as a young boy in the court, owed everything he did to the emperor, but he never was a murid. As indeed Man Singh, again, owed everything to the emperor, but never became a murid, never became a formal follower of Sulh-e-Kul or Deen-e-Ilahi, as you term it. But how important was religion for the Mughals as they contemplated or embarked upon military or political moves? I think they were very practical people. I don't think religion in that sense entered their calculations as much as we would like to think today. They may use it as a cover, or they may use it as an envelope to justify one or the other of their actions. But really, the core of their policies was driven by very, very secular ideas of how to expand the empire, how to maximize your revenues, how to get most plunder out of one particular expedition, and so on. In that sense, religion did not really enter into their calculations. This does change, in my view, and this is controversial. This does change with Aurangzeb's reign, but there also, I think it was not so much his policies which were religiously defined or religiously oriented, but the cover he gave to them. That was much more pronounced. It was a much more pronounced Islamic envelope than his predecessor emperors had wanted to use.
All right, so we have time for 2 more questions. I suggest that we take them together and then you can answer both. So first over here, and then we'll go over here.
If we had to see, Rahim Khan in a Mughal court, which was coming through a new Akbari dispensation, which was based on Sulh-e-Kul, and particularly 1590s, if we are talking about, and we try to reason his work in that kind of a melting pot, that kind of an atmosphere, or is it valid to even or is it valid to even investigate him on the lines of being an opportunist? As an history student, how am I to find semblance and to reason out his works?
Okay, hold on. Hold on, let's take a second question, then you can answer both. Right at the front here, second row. Right here.
Hello, Raghavan sir. So my question is more contemporary. That I want. So we have all have read Rahim Ke Dohe and everything in our classes, but what I want to ask is that why the political and military life of Rahim is not being discussed or told to students, even when you are reading Rahim Ke Dohe. So you know Rahim as a poet, but not as a someone who have a military and political interest in the Mughal era. So do you think it's more like of an Indianization of a poet, or like assimilating him into the good part of him instead of him being a Muslim and all those things?
Well, to answer the first, was Abdur Rahim an opportunist? Well, in a sense, he was as much of an opportunist as any one of us are, that he was following his self-interest, he was trying to secure the best possible deal for himself and his sons and his family, and he had to make difficult choices to make sure that he could achieve these goals. So I think the term opportunist casts him in a particular light. I would prefer to see him as a flesh and blood figure. I mean, try to evaluate him in much the same way as we would evaluate a public figure or a political figure today, that he had to appear different things at different times. He had to appeal to a wider and more diversified constituency than we would like to imagine. And therefore, he had to do all of what he did. I think to say that we should not look at him in those terms, or it's not valid to locate him in his particular environment, would be doing him an injustice. Because that way you take away from the scale of his achievements. And also you take away, you in some ways erode the legacy which he has left for us. On the second question, I would tend to agree that we should teach a lot more about Rahim the general, Rahim the nobleman and the courtier, and not just stick to Rahim and his dohas. Because while the dohas are beautiful, they're exquisite, and in many ways they remind me of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius and his meditations, because these are meditations about life, politics, interest, friendship, loyalty, and so on. But the dohas, and this is what many people have argued, and I agree with them, dohas really belong to the last decade of Rahim's life, when he's looking back, somewhat saddened, but looking back on a life full of activity. The younger Rahim and the more mature Rahim is also writing a great deal of love poetry, Shringar Ras. He's also experimenting with different poetical forms. He's a great patron of painting. He was one of the greatest patrons of Persian literature in the Mughal court. And in some Persian histories, they rate him even higher than the Mughal emperor himself. So I would agree that yes, we have to teach Rahim, and we have to approach Rahim in all these different ways, and not just look at his moral verses or his devotional verses, and try to make him into a Hindu Rahiman rather than a Abdur Rahim Khane Khanan.
Very good. And are we done? Is that, yeah, so, all right, so sorry? What? Okay, let us take one final question, please, right up here.
What about the poets and the later Mughal rulers like Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb? Have you written anything about them in this book?
No, I've written just one book. I became a writer after 35 years as a civil servant and a diplomat. But I'll think about it for my next book.
So yeah, if I can just say, having spoken to Mr. Raghavan in private, he does have a sort of ambitious publishing agenda going forward, both about Indian history as well as sort of ancient medieval history, as well as more modern history. So Thank you all for joining us. T.C.A Raghavan will be signing your copies of Attendant Lords outside after.
Thank you again to T.C.A Raghavan and also to Audrey Truschke for her help in that session. Thank you very much. As mentioned, Mr. Raghavan will be signing his books. The book signing tent is out of